Just a nurse. That's what they called her. Margaret Walsh moved through the corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital in Philadelphia like someone who'd learned to be invisible, her scrubs 2 sizes too large, her eyes trained on the linoleum tiles beneath her feet. Nobody asked questions about the woman who worked nights, who never complained, who could start and for in complete darkness and knew field triage better than residents who'd actually read the textbooks. They didn't know. Not one of them knew that the quiet nurse eating lunch alone at the bus stop across the street had spent 17 years in special forces, that her hands had held together soldiers whose names were now classified, that she'd been erased so thoroughly from official records that Margaret Walsh no longer officially existed. The dog tag beneath her scrubs, hidden on a broken chain, was the only proof she'd ever been anyone at all. And then he wheeled in on a Tuesday morning, the man whose testimony had destroyed her, and everything changed. The night shift at Sacred Heart started at 11. Margaret arrived at 10:13, the way she did every evening, 15 minutes early, because punctuality was discipline and discipline was all she had left. The ER doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and she stepped into the antiseptic burn of fluorescent lighting, that smell like cleaning chemicals mixed with something medical and anonymous. Her locker was in the basement, 3rd row from the left, behind a corner where nobody lingered. She dressed in the same movements every time, uniform first, badge clipped to the left pocket, hair in a regulation bun. Her fingers found the dog tag before her hand reached the doorknob. Still there. Still real. The engraved surface, worn smooth from 15 years of nervous touches, pressed against her collarbone as she climbed the stairs back to the ICU. The unit was calm at 11 p.m. 3 occupied beds, 1 coding patient downstairs in the trauma bay, and the kind of quiet that meant the night shift would be watching and waiting and hoping nothing went sideways before sunrise. The board showed 7 available beds. 7 empty spaces. Margaret checked her assignment and found her name listed as M. Walsh next to rooms 4, 6, and 7. Just letters, no first name. Just a title. That's how she existed now, a call sign in scrubs, a body that performed tasks without drawing attention. She moved to the supply room and began her rounds, checking medication counts, restocking trauma trays, running through the mental protocol that had never left her mind in 3 years at Sacred Heart. Level 1 infuser. Defib pads. Airway trays in ascending size order. The tasks were muscle memory, the same way that her hand still remembered how to field dress a chest wound or assemble a tourniquet from bootlaces and a stick. By 1 a.m., the unit had settled into the rhythm of night, beeping monitors, the soft wheeze of ventilators, the occasional page overhead for a resident who hadn't answered their first 3 calls. Margaret moved between rooms with the kind of efficient grace that came from training that had cost the Department of Defense $400,000 and had officially never happened. She knew how to read a patient's breathing pattern by the sound alone. She knew the difference between normal post-operative pain and the kind of pain that meant something was bleeding internally. She knew that the monitor in room 6 was about to alarm because the patient's potassium was dropping and she'd been watching the labs, and she knew that the standard protocol would be to wait for a doctor, and she also knew that nobody needed to wait when the fix took 90 seconds. At 2:15 a.m., she sat at the bus stop across the street. The shift had a built-in break, 30 minutes, unpaid, where she left the building and sat on the metal bench that overlooked Callowhill Street. The rain had started around midnight, and by 2 a.m. it was hammering the asphalt like applause, and she sat beneath the shelter with her lunchbox containing the same sandwich she'd made that morning, turkey, no mayo, the crusts cut off because old habits meant careful about calories and careful about waste. The bus stop was empty except for her. It always was at this hour. The city was sleeping. The hospital behind her was doing what hospitals did at 2 in the morning, keeping people alive, managing pain, waiting for sunrise. Her fingers found the dog tag. They always did. The chain was broken, had been broken since 2007, when shrapnel from an IED in Tikrit had punched through the wooden frame of a compound wall and taken 3 of her team with it. The dog tag had survived. It was stamped with numbers instead of a name because after the operation, after the intelligence grab that 3 senators wanted buried, they'd made a choice, accept the medal in a locked drawer or accept a trial that would expose everything. She'd chosen silence. They'd chosen erasure. The next day, she was transferred to a desk job. The day after that, she was processed through Joint Base McGuire-Dix-Lakehurst and handed a civilian ID card and told never to surface again. Major Margaret Walsh was redacted. She was filed away. She was a ghost wearing scrubs at Sacred Heart Hospital, eating sandwiches at bus stops, touching a dog tag that couldn't prove she'd ever existed. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled across the city like distant artillery. She didn't flinch. Rain was rain. Noise was noise. She finished her sandwich and sat for the remaining 8 minutes of her break, the dog tag pressed beneath the fabric of her scrubs against her ribs like a second heartbeat. By 3:08 a.m., she was back in the ICU. The unit was preparing for admissions. The operating room had just finished a trauma case, a pedestrian versus vehicle, multiple fractures, bleeding controlled, stable enough for post-op observation. Margaret checked the incoming patient file, 58-year-old male, severe crushing injuries to the lower extremities, paralysis from mid-thoracic down, prognosis guarded, family in the waiting room. She was reading the chart when the elevator doors opened and the gurney rolled through. 12 nurses. 2 residents. 1 attending. A full trauma team escorting a man whose legs would never work again. And Margaret Walsh looked up from the paper and froze, not a flinch, not a tremor, just a single moment where her entire body went absolutely still, because she knew that face. Older. Thinner. Different. But unmistakable. Colonel James Rourke. The man whose testimony had sent her to a court-martial for the reckless disregard for command structure. The man who'd sat in that hearing room and described her as unstable, dangerous, a liability to every soldier under her command. The man whose words had burned through 3 years of her career and left her empty and erased. And now he was being wheeled into bed 7, the one Margaret had just finished preparing an hour ago. The universe had a specific kind of cruelty, apparently. She didn't move. She didn't acknowledge. She simply turned her focus back to the medication cart and continued filling syringes with the calm that came from having already survived the worst. Rourke was being transferred onto the bed by 2 orderlies who moved with practiced efficiency. His daughter was following alongside, holding his hand, saying something Margaret couldn't hear but could read from the curve of her lips, "You're going to be okay. We'll get through this." A lie that sounded like love. A promise that sounded like hope. Margaret had made those same promises once, to soldiers who didn't make it home. And then the ICU doors opened again. Dr. Richard Caldwell stepped into the unit at 3:42 a.m. like a man who owned the air he breathed. He was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of expensive casual that meant old money and older confidence. His white coat was pristine. His shoes were Italian leather. He had the bearing of someone who'd never been told no in any meaningful way, the look of a man who believed that titles and institutional hierarchy were interchangeable with actual authority and actual respect. He glanced around the unit, that calculating coldness in his eyes, and Margaret felt it immediately, the attention of a predator who'd just noticed something that didn't fit his ordered world. A nurse who moved too efficiently. A woman who stood at parade rest when he passed. A presence that was both invisible and somehow visible in all the wrong ways. Caldwell's gaze landed on her and locked. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds. Long enough for him to process that she was different from the other night shift nurses. Not visibly different, she wore the same scrubs, the same shoes, clipped her badge the same way. But different in the way that experienced predators notice prey that might be something more dangerous than they initially appear. Different in the way that men accustomed to control notice the one variable in the room that might not respond to his authority the way everything else did. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was the look of a man who'd identified a problem and was already calculating how to solve it. She turned back to her medications. Potassium chloride. Magnesium sulfate. Insulin in the insulin infuser. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her breathing was perfectly controlled. She was a nurse. She was invisible. She was nobody. And in the reflection of the medication bottle, she watched Caldwell move toward Rourke's bed, already beginning whatever rounds meant when you were a man who believed the unit's hierarchy was something you could enforce through sheer force of will. The rain continued outside. The monitors continued beeping. Sacred Heart Hospital moved through the night like a ship moving through dark water, unaware that the water beneath it contained things it couldn't see. The monitors continued their steady percussion through the night, a rhythm Margaret had learned to sleep through years ago. But on Tuesday, when Colonel James Rourke was wheeled into ICU Bed 7, the beeping changed. It became a countdown. His daughter Claire pushed the chair, her hand trembling on the grip, and when Margaret looked up from the vital station, time did something strange. It stopped. She recognized him immediately, the sharp jawline, the grey threading through his temples, the scar tissue along his left ear from shrapnel in Tikrit that she shouldn't have known about but did. Her fingers found the dog tag beneath her scrubs without thinking. The chain caught against her collarbone. Once, just once, she let herself look directly at him, and Rourke's eyes locked onto hers for a single suspended second. His pupils dilated. Recognition flickered. Then Claire spoke and the moment fractured. "Thank you for getting him settled," Claire said, her voice tight with the exhaustion of a daughter watching her father disappear inside himself one day at a time. Margaret nodded without speaking. Speech was dangerous. Speech required breath control she didn't have any more. Dr. Richard Caldwell arrived at 14:30 with his chart tucked under one arm like a general carrying battle maps. He was a man who moved through rooms the way weather moved through buildings, not asking permission, simply redirecting the air pressure around him. 2 residents trailed behind him, their white coats still stiff from the dry cleaner, their eyes tracking his every gesture the way prey animals track predators. He reviewed Rourke's medication list with the deliberate slowness of someone performing for an audience. Then he looked at Margaret. "Reduce the pain management by half," he said. Not asked. Stated. The way you might order a soldier to move a sandbag wall 3 feet to the left. Margaret's spine straightened. Muscle memory. The voice that came out wasn't deferential, it was professional, measured, the voice of someone who had calculated a problem and found it wanting. "Doctor, his neuropathic pain profile suggests the current dose is baseline. Reduction could compromise mobility rehabilitation." She gestured to the chart. "His PT starts tomorrow." The room went still. Caldwell's jaw tightened along the angle where it met his neck. He turned to the resident slowly, deliberately, the way a performer turns to an audience during a play. "When you complete medical school," he said, each word its own sentence, "you can question my orders." He smiled. It wasn't warm. "Until then, stay in your lane. Nurse Walsh." The emphasis on her name tasted like poison in the air. "Your lane is charting vitals, not practicing medicine." One of the residents winced. Claire's hand went white-knuckled on the bed rail. Margaret said nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't nod. She simply returned to the 4-line, checking the flow, checking the tape, checking anything that wasn't his face. But Caldwell wasn't finished. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne trying to cover something cheaper underneath, sweat and ambition. 3 years ago, you asked me a question about a medication order. Do you remember?" She didn't answer. "I'm going to recommend that this hospital invest in additional training. Specifically on scope of practice. For night shift nursing staff." He turned to Claire. "Colonel Rourke, please be assured that you're in a facility that takes proper hierarchy very seriously. Chain of command isn't just military doctrine, it's how institutions survive." That afternoon, Margaret discovered her name on the unit board in red marker. M. the Walsh, insubordination, questioning physician protocol. Every nurse who passed the supply station could read it. Every resident, every attending, every hospital administrator who made rounds would see it. The words were a scarlet letter printed in ballpoint and shame. Beth, a nurse who'd shared her lunch twice that month, avoided her eyes in the hallway. The evening shift supervisor made a note in the digital system about Margaret's recent attitude concerns. By 4 p.m., word had spread through Sacred Heart's grapevine like an infection moving through tissue. Caldwell had flagged her, written her up, begun the paperwork. Termination review scheduled. The whispers moved behind her like a current. The next morning, Caldwell entered Rourke's room while Margaret was checking his oxygen saturation. She'd noticed it dipping to 91% during the night, nothing emergent, but worth monitoring. Worth adjusting positioning. Worth knowing. Claire sat in the corner armchair, a magazine open but unread in her lap. Caldwell made a show of reviewing the monitors, clicking his pen against his teeth, the kind of deliberate irritation that announced he was performing. "Colonel Rourke," he began, voice pitched to fill the room, "I apologize for the nursing staff. We seem to have hired someone with delusions about her medical expertise." He paused. The room held its breath. "Night shift Nancy, we call her. She seems convinced that 3 years of pushing pills makes her qualified to override a physician with 2 decades of trauma medicine." He turned to face Margaret directly. His expression was the expression of a man who'd learned that cruelty, delivered correctly, was indistinguishable from power. "Tell me, Nancy, did you serve? Do you have any concept of what this decorated officer has sacrificed? Any understanding of what actual responsibility feels like?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to be absorbed. To be carried like a weight in the chest. Claire's magazine fell to the floor. Rourke's expression shifted, something moved across his face, a tectonic shift underneath the surface, but he didn't speak. His hands, trembling slightly on the bed rails, trembled a fraction more. Margaret took one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in crisis management training, the kind trained into special forces operatives before they're dropped into territory where one wrong inhalation means death. In, for 4 counts. Hold, for 7. Out, for 8. Her jaw tightened along the angle where it met her neck, the same angle where Caldwell's jaw had tightened when she'd questioned him. A mirror. Symmetry. A physical response she couldn't suppress. A single tear escaped. Not from sadness. From something deeper. From the specific gravity of standing in a room where she wasn't supposed to exist and being made invisible by someone smaller than her. The tear traced down her cheek, and she watched it the way an astronomer might watch a star burning out, with the recognition that some fires take years to die. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "Respect," she said, and her voice carried the weight of a woman who'd spent 3 years in silence, who'd held that silence like a loaded weapon, who knew the precise cost of every word she didn't say, isn't measured by who can humiliate who, doctor. Caldwell's face hardened into something granite-like. His hand gripped his pen tighter. For a moment, a suspended, impossible moment, something flickered across his expression that looked like recognition. Like he'd been struck by something he couldn't quite see. Then it vanished. "My office," he said quietly. "Tomorrow. Performance review." He turned and left before anyone could respond. Claire whispered something to her father. Rourke's eye stayed fixed on the doorway where Caldwell had disappeared. Margaret continued her checks without speaking, oxygen, for line, cardiac monitor, moving with the precise efficiency of someone whose body knew how to function even when her mind had gone somewhere far away. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint copperpenny scent of old blood beneath bandages, of the sterile institutional air that never quite smelled like anything except distance. By week's end, the break room had become a geography of exclusion. Margaret would sit down with her coffee, lukewarm, black, the color of hospital hallways at 3 a.m., and conversations would stop mid-sentence. Nurses would gather their papers and scatter like birds disturbed by an approaching storm. The evening shift supervisor stopped scheduling her near other staff members. The younger residents who'd been trailing Caldwell began looking at her the way guards look at prisoners who violated unspoken protocols. Word had circulated through Sacred Heart's entire ecosystem, challenging the chief physician had consequences, and those consequences adhered to you like a second skin. By Friday, Beth avoided the elevator if Margaret was in it. The charge nurse stopped asking her opinion on patient load decisions. She was being erased by increments, written out of the institution's social fabric one interaction at a time. The humiliation wasn't a single event anymore, it was becoming weather, an atmosphere she existed within, inescapable and total. That Friday evening, she ate lunch at the bus stop across the street, rain falling in thick sheets that hammered the concrete like applause no one wanted to hear. Her fingers found the dog tag beneath her scrubs, the broken chain holding it worn smooth by 3 years of obsessive touching. She pulled it out slightly, let it rest against the fabric of her uniform, the metal cold even through the cotton. The tag had no name on it anymore. The government had made sure of that. It was just wait now. Just a reminder that she'd been someone once, before Tikrit, before the classified operation that 3 senators wanted buried, before the choice between a medal in a locked drawer and a trial that would expose them. She'd chosen silence. The dog tag was the only piece of Major Margaret Walsh she'd allowed herself to keep. The rain continued. Cars splashed through puddles. The world moved past her like she was scenery, like she was part of the infrastructure of the city rather than a person existing within it. Inside Sacred Heart, behind the glass windows, she could see the fluorescent lights flickering to life as evening descended. The nurses on day shift were clocking out, heading toward doors, toward homes, toward lives where they weren't marked by one bad interaction with an institutional power that never lost, never bent, never apologized. The bus came. She didn't board it. Instead, she sat in her car in the hospital parking garage later that night, the dog tag loose in her palm, and for the first time in 3 years, she considered the alternative to silence. The FBI liaison who'd maintained contact, one phone call away. The general she'd served under who'd promised that if the situation ever became untenable, he'd move mountains. The specific gravity of running again versus staying. Of disappearing again versus being erased by this man, molecule by molecule. She stared at the cracked mug on her passenger seat, her own mug from home, the one she'd brought to work last month and forgotten to take back. It had a chip on the rim. Inside it, in her apartment, was a dying succulent that hadn't been watered properly in weeks. Both of those things were hers. Both of them were failures. Both of them meant she'd tried to have something normal. Margaret Walsh, the nurse, the woman who'd pushed medication and held dying patients' hands and asked questions about pain management, was being unmade by a man in an expensive suit who'd learned early that control was indistinguishable from leadership. And Margaret Walsh, the major, the soldier, the woman who'd moved through darkness in Tikrit and made decisions that couldn't be unmade, was still here, still real, still present beneath the scrubs and the silence. The dog tag pressed into her palm. Metal and meaning. The only thing stopping her from the telephone. The charts were always the first thing Margaret checked on her morning rounds. Patient vitals, medication logs, lab results, the whole story of a body written in numbers and abbreviations. Sacred Heart's electronic system hummed quietly at the nursing station as she scrolled through the latest workups, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent more hours reading medical data than sleeping. That's when she saw it. Colonel James Rourke's D-dimer level. 247 nanograms per milliliter 3 days ago. 289 yesterday. 312 this morning. The numbers climbing like a fever graph, each one a small warning bell that nobody else seemed to hear. She didn't move. Just stared at the screen. D-dimer elevated meant one thing in a paralyzed patient, blood clots forming somewhere in that immobilized body, pieces of clot breaking loose and traveling toward the lungs. Pulmonary embolism. The kind of thing that killed you quietly, then all at once. Margaret's jaw tightened. She knew that number sequence. She'd seen it before, in a field hospital outside Fallujah in 2007, on a young Marine whose femur had been shattered by shrapnel. Same climbing pattern. Same silent escalation. They'd gotten him on anticoagulation in time. The ones they didn't catch fast enough never made it to the medevac helicopter. She pulled up the CT orders. Nothing. No angiogram, no imaging protocol, nothing that would show whether a clot had already lodged in his pulmonary arteries. Just pain management orders and physical therapy notes that read like a narrative of slow decline. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that perpetual institutional drone that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. She didn't let herself listen. Instead, she printed the labs and found Dr. Richard Caldwell during morning rounds. He was moving through the ICU like a man surveying property he owned. Starched white coat that never had a wrinkle, eyes that moved across patients without actually seeing them, the kind of authority that came from having won every institutional battle for the last 15 years. 2 residents followed in his wake like satellites around a planet, writing down whatever he said as if his words were gospel that needed documentation. Margaret waited until he'd finished with another patient, then stepped into his path with the labs in her hand. Professional. Respectful. Exactly what a nurse with 3 years of perfect silence should sound like. Dr. Colonel Rourke's labs from this morning. She extended the printout. His D-dimer has been climbing for 3 days. 247 to 312 nanograms. Given his immobility, we should be considering pulmonary embolism risk. I think a CT angiogram. Caldwell didn't take the papers. Didn't even glance down. His eyes went flat, the kind of flat that came right before someone decided to use their power. Nurse Walsh. Not her name. Just a label, delivered like an accusation. Why are you looking at Colonel Rourke's chart? The question hung in the air like something that might bite. The residents kept writing, their pens scratching the only sound in the sudden silence. Margaret felt the weight of the moment, not the medical emergency, not the climbing numbers that meant something was going wrong, but this. The institutional power dynamic. The line she'd just crossed by suggesting something a physician hadn't already decided. I saw the labs while updating the medication log, Margaret said. Calm. The kind of calm that came from having faced things worse than institutional hierarchy. His D-dimer trajectory suggests we should rule out DVT and you're not on his care team. Caldwell's voice dropped an octave, not with menace but with the certainty of someone accustomed to obedience. And you're certainly not paid to interpret diagnostic labs. That's scope creep, Nurse Walsh. Dangerous scope creep. He turned to face her fully now, and she saw something flicker behind his eyes, and not anger, something more calculated. Recognition. The look a predator gets when it identifies something that doesn't move the way prey is supposed to move. You're not paid to think, he continued, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. You're paid to follow orders. Consider this your final warning. He turned back to the residents without waiting for a response. Note for education, he said, his voice loud enough that 3 nearby nurses turned to listen. Nurses who exceed their scope of practice create institutional liability. They compromise the hierarchy that keeps hospitals functioning. When a nurse starts making clinical recommendations, she's no longer a nurse. She's a threat to patient safety. The words landed the way he'd intended. Margaret felt them settle into the room like sediment. The residents wrote them down. The other nurses looked away. And Caldwell continued his rounds as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just classified her as a liability in front of the entire morning team. That night, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed in her 1-bedroom apartment in northeast Philadelphia, staring at the locked metal box in her bedroom closet. 3 years since she'd looked inside. 3 years of pretending it didn't exist. The box contained her discharge papers, the redacted ones, the ones that didn't explain anything. Her medals, locked in a velvet bag. A photograph of her unit in 2006, 7 faces, only 2 of them still alive. And beneath everything, the original copy of the court-martial transcript. The one that had led to Rourke's dismissal of the charges against her, followed immediately by her own erasure from every military database. She hadn't opened that box since arriving in Philadelphia. Hadn't needed to. The dog tag was enough, the single piece of metal on a broken chain she kept beneath her scrubs, cold against her sternum like a question she wasn't allowed to answer. That was the only memory she'd allowed herself. Derek found her that way when he came home late from his shift at the grocery store, still wearing his red uniform shirt, still carrying the smell of the produce section, cut lettuce and wet concrete from the loading dock. Mom. He dropped his bag by the door. At 17, he was already taller than her, still carrying the softness of someone who hadn't learned that the world breaks people. "What are you doing?" Margaret looked up. For a moment, she considered telling him. Considered opening the box and explaining who she really was, what she'd given up for silence, why she'd chosen obscurity over accountability. Considered all the things a mother should be able to tell her son. Instead, she closed the closet door. "I'm fine, baby," she said. "Just tired." She wasn't fine. Her hands were steady, but her chest felt compressed, as if Caldwell's words had physical weight. The hospital was methodical. Institutional. And Caldwell understood how to use both against her. He'd written her up for insubordination. He'd warned her publicly in front of the entire medical team. And that was just the opening. The next morning, Margaret reported for her shift at 6:22 a.m., 23 minutes before her official start time, the kind of discipline that came from military training, from years of arriving early, checking equipment, making sure everything was ready. She'd been doing it without thinking for 3 years. At 10:15 a.m., the phone at the nursing station buzzed. Her line. The receptionist didn't look at her as she handed over the receiver. "Nurse Walsh." Caldwell's voice, calm and administrative. "Come to my office. Now." The walk down the hospital corridor felt longer than usual. Fluorescent lights hummed their institutional song. The wall smelled of antiseptic and the particular kind of institutional hopelessness that came from watching people suffer and being unable to help them in any way that mattered. Margaret's composure didn't crack. Her pace didn't change. But her right hand, the one that wasn't holding the phone, unconsciously moved to her sternum, to the dog tag beneath her scrubs, cold metal pressed against her heart. Caldwell's office was on the administrative floor, all polished mahogany and framed certifications from places that cost money to attend. He sat behind his desk as if he'd been expecting her, which he had. The kind of expectation that came from carefully laid plans. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending termination review." His words came out like a prepared statement, which they were. "Your personnel file indicates a pattern of insubordination, attitude concerns, and scope violations. I've documented everything, the incident with Rourke, your comments to other staff members about patient care protocols, your general resistance to institutional hierarchy." Margaret didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that the words that came after accusations weren't usually meant to be answered. They were meant to be absorbed. "I've also made calls to hospital administrators across Philadelphia," Caldwell continued, "to ensure we're all operating with the same standards. You won't find work at any major medical facility in this city." The room felt smaller than it should have. Margaret could smell his cologne, something expensive that cost more than she made in a week, mixed with the sharp scent of paper and the stale air of a room where uncomfortable conversations happened regularly. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out quieter than she intended. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. He smiled. Just barely, just enough to show that he understood something she didn't think he'd noticed. The kind of smile that came from someone who'd just neutralized a threat. "Sacred Heart has standards," he said. "This institution runs on hierarchy. We have protocols because protocols keep hospitals functioning. Nurses who think they're heroes, who think they can make clinical decisions, who think their opinions matter, they destabilize everything. They create confusion. They undermine authority." He paused. "Let the silence stretch out between them. And they need to be removed before they infect the entire culture." The words landed but didn't stick. Margaret had survived things worse than institutional rejection. She'd survived classified operations in Iraq. She'd survived court-martials and erasure and 3 years of quiet isolation. She'd survived the particular kind of pain that comes from knowing you'd been buried by the people you'd served. But knowing she had 8 hours left before security escorted her out of the hospital, knowing that Rourke's D-dimer was still climbing, still heading toward a clot that would lodge in his lungs, still timing out toward something fatal, that was something else. She left Caldwell's office without responding. The composure held all the way down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the ICU where she'd spent the last 3 years becoming invisible. It didn't crack when she clocked out at the end of her shift. It didn't crack when security walked her to her car. But that night, sitting in her parking garage with the radio off and the engine running, Margaret's hand found the dog tag again. Metal, cold and real and undeniable. The only proof that Major Margaret Walsh had ever existed. The code alarm screamed at 2:08 p.m. on a Tuesday when the rain hammered Philadelphia like a judgment. ICU bed 7. Rourke. Margaret heard it from the security office downstairs where she was turning in her badge, the plastic rectangle that had been her only identity for 3 years. She didn't think. She moved. The badge clattered onto the desk behind her as she sprinted toward the stairwell, her scrub shoes gripping tile with the same precision that had kept her alive in Tikrit when mortar rounds turned dirt into shrapnel. 4th floor. The ICU corridors narrowed like arteries closing. She burst through the double doors and the scene hit her like a physical force, Rourke's monitor screaming its electronic death rattle, his oxygen saturation dropping with the relentless mathematics of catastrophe. 72%. 68%. 65%. His lips were turning blue. His chest wasn't moving right, the left side shallow, the right side heaving like a drowning man gasping for air that wouldn't come. Tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing, probably triggered by the pulmonary embolism she'd warned Caldwell about 3 days ago. Caldwell! She saw him standing frozen at the monitor, his hand raised to his mouth, textbook knowledge failing like a compass in a magnetic storm. His eyes were moving but not processing. A first-year resident was at the bedside, hands trembling, trying to remember what page the answer was on. Margaret didn't ask. She didn't request. Her voice dropped 2 octaves and cut through the room like a blade through silk. Tension pneumothorax. He's coding from a PE. Lungs collapsing. She was already moving, muscle memory igniting, the kind of automatic precision that comes from doing this in the dark with rounds overhead. 14-gauge needle. Chest tube kit. Now. The resident stammered something about protocol. Margaret's eyes found his and froze him in place. Now means now. The crash cart nurse scrambled. Margaret pulled open her locker with both hands and her fingers found what she'd kept since Fort Bragg, an MRE wrapper, olive drab and faded, from a survival packet she'd never thrown away because you never knew. Muscle memory was data. Instinct was intelligence. She tore open the wrapper with her teeth, her hand steady as a surgical laser, and fashioned a makeshift chest seal, her palms pressing it against his left upper chest wall, the needle finding the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with the kind of anatomical certainty that only came from having done this before. Air hissed. His oxygen climbed. 68%. 72%. Caldwell tried to move forward, his voice finding words again. Nurse Walsh, you are not authorized to. She didn't look at him. Shut up or he dies. It wasn't a request. It was a command. She manually stabilized his lung with her palm, counting her heartbeats, her own breathing steady as a metronome while machines shrieked around her. One hand holding his chest, the other guiding the resident's hands to start the heparin drip, her voice a low percussion of orders that turned panic into choreography. Tilt the bed. 15 degrees. Manual suction. Someone get me O2 at 15 liters. Talk to me about his vitals. The nurses moved like they were remembering a language they'd learned in another life. Margaret held him. 11 minutes. That's how long she pressed her palm against his collapsing lung while his blood oxygen climbed and his heart rate came down from the stratosphere of 142 to something that wouldn't kill him. 11 minutes of her hands holding together a man who had destroyed her career, her reputation, her entire existence with a single testimony spoken under oath. 11 minutes of her not caring about that because pain was data and his data said he was dying and she was the only person in the room who knew how to keep him alive. The trauma team crashed through the doors like the hand of God. The attending looked at the monitor, looked at Rourke's stabilizing vitals, looked at Margaret's face, blank as a stone, and said, "Who the hell are you?" She didn't answer. She stepped back. Her hands fell to her sides. The attending moved in, taking over, barking orders at people who actually had permission to give them. Caldwell was watching her. His face was the color of old paper. His jaw was clenched tight enough to fracture teeth. He'd just watched a suspended nurse, someone he'd written up, someone he'd ordered security to escort out, move with the authority of a general and the precision of a surgeon. He'd watched her speak and have people obey. He'd watched her save a life and move like the room was hers to command. That expression meant nothing to Margaret. She turned to walk back out, and there he was, standing between her and the exit, his voice careful and quiet in a way that made it more dangerous than screaming. "You're done here, Walsh. You understand that? Security is escorting you out. Your termination is effective immediately." His voice carried the weight of institutional power, the kind of absolute authority that comes from controlling schedules and recommendations and access. "Don't come back to this hospital. Don't come back to Philadelphia. I've made calls. No one will touch you." She didn't argue. She walked past him to her locker, the small metal rectangle in the staff changing room that had held her name on a printed label for 3 years. Everything she owned that mattered came out in 90 seconds, the framed photo of her team taken in 2006, 7 soldiers, only 2 of them still alive, the rest of them ghosts. A cracked coffee mug from a base exchange in Fort Bragg. A succulent that had been dying since October. The dog tag on its broken chain that she kept hidden beneath her scrubs, the only object in the universe that could prove who she actually was. Security walked her to the exit like she was a criminal. Caldwell stood in the hallway watching, his arms crossed, making sure she actually left. Margaret didn't look at him. She carried the cardboard box and walked through Sacred Heart's lobby where she'd worked 3 years in perfect obscurity, and nobody watching saw anything other than a nurse who'd screwed up, fired, escorted out, erased from the unit. The rain hit her like a baptism the moment she stepped outside. Philadelphia in the autumn, cold and relentless, the kind of rain that comes from the Atlantic with anger in it. She stood at the bus stop across the street where she usually ate lunch alone, cardboard box balanced on her hip, the photo of her team visible through the open flap. 7 faces. 12 years and 4 months ago. Now she was back to having nothing, no job, no identity, no way to explain to anyone why a suspended nurse could intubate a patient with her eyes closed or hold a collapsing lung stable with nothing but an MRE wrapper and 12 years of combat training. The rain hammered down and mixed with something on her cheeks that she wouldn't call tears because tears were a luxury and she couldn't afford luxuries anymore. She'd been erased twice now. The first time, after Tikrit, when 3 senators decided she was more useful as a ghost. Now, erased again by a man who thought he held all the power because he had a title and a hospital and the ability to make calls that shut down lives. She stood in the rain for 40 minutes, cardboard box getting soggy, the photo of her team slowly warping, the dog tag hanging beneath her scrubs, cold against her skin, the only proof that Major Margaret Walsh had ever been real. That she'd ever existed at all. That she'd ever held anything together besides a collapsing lung in a hospital where nobody knew her name. When the bus finally came, she didn't get on. Instead, she walked home through the rain, soaking through, the cardboard box disintegrating slowly in her arms. Thunder rolled across the city like distant artillery. She didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. She'd held together under circumstances that would have broken anyone else, and now she was walking through Philadelphia in the rain with everything she owned falling apart in a wet box, and the only thing real was the weight of a single dog tag hanging beneath her scrubs like a secret nobody would ever need to know. That evening, sitting in her apartment with the termination letter spreading moisture across her kitchen table, she was still touching the dog tag through the fabric of her shirt. Still feeling its shape. Still waiting for something to change. She didn't know her 17-year-old son Derek was about to walk through that door. She didn't know he'd found her locked box in storage. She didn't know that in less than 3 hours, the entire edifice of her erasure was going to come apart in a hospital conference room with 50 witnesses and nowhere left to hide who she actually was. The emergency meeting was called at 3:11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Dr. Richard Caldwell sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, flanked by 3 members of Sacred Heart's administrative board, their expressions arranged somewhere between concern and obligation. Margaret wasn't present. She didn't need to be. The narrative had already been written before she arrived for her shift. Caldwell opened a folder with the care of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Schedule logs," he announced, sliding printed pages across the polished surface. Nurse Walsh violated ICU access protocols on 17 separate occasions. After-hours entries. Patient contact outside assigned rotations. He tapped a finger on the documents like a man who had spent the previous night fabricating timestamps. This isn't insubordination. This is a patient safety issue. The board members exchanged glances. One of them, Patricia Chen, the chief administrator, leaned forward to examine the logs. The entries looked legitimate. Caldwell had been meticulous. He'd copied her badge swipe data from legitimate shifts, then layered in false entries from nights she'd never been there. To anyone without access to the actual badge readers, the documentation was airtight. Her behavior has escalated since Colonel Rourke's admission, Caldwell continued, his voice taking on the tone of a disappointed mentor forced to report a talented student's fall from grace. She's become obsessed with his case. She's bypassing chain of command. She's inserting herself into clinical decisions that aren't her role. He paused, letting the silence do its work. We have a responsibility to investigate. By 4:15 p.m., the decision was made. Margaret Walsh's ICU security clearance would be revoked effective immediately. She would be escorted from the floor. A full termination review would commence within 72 hours. The board thanked Dr. Caldwell for his diligence in protecting the hospital's integrity. He walked her out at 4:43 p.m., personally, in front of witnesses, a detail he'd insisted on, wanting everyone to see the controlled removal of a problem employee. His hand never touched her arm, but his presence beside her was a visible condemnation. They moved through the ICU corridors in silence. Nurses at the station pretended not to watch. Margaret kept her eyes forward, her jaw set at that familiar angle, the one that suggested she was looking at something no one else could see. At the security checkpoint, Margaret surrendered her badge. The plastic felt warm against her palm. 3 years of movements encoded in that small rectangle, every shift, every moment, every time she'd entered the place she'd called her life. Caldwell's voice was quiet, conversational, the way powerful men speak when they've already won. "It's better this way, Margaret. You never fit here. You were always going to be a problem." He smiled, and it looked like something carved from bone. Sacred Heart has standards. We build institutions on respect for hierarchy. And nurses who think they're heroes, who imagine themselves as something more than they are, they destabilize everything we've constructed. Margaret turned to face him. For 3 years, she'd absorbed his condescension, his casual digs, the way he'd treated her like a technician rather than a colleague. She'd taken it because speaking up meant exposure, meant questions, meant the kind of attention that would send government handlers to her door. But in that moment, something shifted in her expression, not rage, but clarity, the way a soldier's eyes focus right before the ambush is sprung. "Thank you, Doctor," she said. Her voice was steady, each word precisely weighted. "You've made everything very clear." She didn't know that Caldwell spent the next 4 hours on the phone, calling every major hospital in Philadelphia. To each administrator, he spoke with the authority of a man protecting his colleagues. Margaret Walsh is a former Sacred Heart nurse. Behavioral issues. Patient boundary violations. Possibly delusional. You might want to red flag her application. By the time Margaret was sitting at the bus stop that evening, she was already unemployable. The rain came down in sheets, the kind that fell on Philadelphia in late October, cold and without mercy. Margaret stood beneath the shelter, her cardboard box balanced on her hip, its contents meager, a cracked mug from her apartment's kitchen cabinet, a succulent plant that had been dying since summer, a few books she'd meant to reread. All the things that fit into a life when that life was temporary. Her fingers found the photograph in her jacket pocket. 7 faces, arranged in formation outside a compound in Tikrit, 2007. She could name them all. She could remember the exact temperature that day, 112 degrees Fahrenheit, the air so hot it distorted the horizon. She could remember the weight of the intelligence they'd extracted, the names they'd memorized, the intercepts they'd translated. She could remember the moment the orders came down from 3 senators in Washington: bury it, or face a trial that would embarrass the entire military-industrial complex. She'd chosen the burial. She'd chosen silence. She'd chosen erasure. And now, watching rain streak the bus shelter glass, she realized she'd been waiting 3 years for something, a sign, a moment, a reason to believe it had been worth it. That choice had cost her everything. Her rank, her identity, her name. She'd given it all up to protect men who didn't deserve protection, who'd hidden behind classified stamps and committee rooms while she became a ghost in her own country. The rain hammered the shelter roof like applause. She clutched the photograph harder, and her breath came shallow. She didn't hear Derek's footsteps at first. Her son was 17, tall enough now that she had to look up when he stood in front of her, and his eyes carried that particular mixture of fury and determination that only teenagers could manage. He was soaking wet, his jacket clinging to him, his breathing hard from running. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the single word. "I found it." In his hands was a locked metal box, no bigger than a showbox, bearing the seals and stamps of military archives. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Margaret understood that everything, the 3 years of silence, the careful erasure, the slow disappearance into the background of other people's stories, was about to collapse. "Derek, no," she said. But he was already moving, already running, already heading back towards Sacred Heart Hospital with the weight of her entire life balanced in those trembling hands. What happened next would silence more than just a room. What happened next would begin the process of unburying a woman the government had declared dead. What happened next would echo across news networks and congressional offices and classified briefing rooms, and there would be no taking it back, no returning to the shadows, no more quiet heroism in a place where nobody knew her name. The rain continued to fall, indifferent, as Margaret stood alone at the bus stop with a cardboard box and the beginning of her resurrection. What would you do if the secret you'd kept for 3 years suddenly became impossible to hide? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the heroes working in silence, the ones we walk past every day without understanding the weight they carry. And drop a comment, tell us whether you would have stopped Derek, or let him run.